Please note, Night Terrors is for a mature audience only. This episode depicts a graphic and violent scene with extreme gore. Welcome back. Tonight's tale deals with a man who is virtually a pillar of the community. Some would call him a role model for today's youth. Let's find out. Dewey Clank was not a man you'd want to cross paths with. Not because he was particularly dangerous, but because the mere sight of him was enough to ruin anyone's day. He was a hulking figure, broad-shouldered but flabby, with a gut that spilled over his belt like a sack of rotten potatoes. His face was perpetually coated in a sheen of sweat and grime, the stubble on his chin thick with the remains of whatever greasy meal he'd last devoured. His breath reeked of alcohol, and his clothes, stained and torn, carried the stench of a man who hadn't bathed in weeks. Dewey spent most of his days in a dimly lit bar on the edge of town, the kind of place where the windows were so dirty you couldn't see inside, and the regulars preferred it that way. It was the middle of the day, yet Dewey was already 3 sheets to the wind, sitting at the bar with a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey in front of him. The bartender, a wiry man with a perpetual frown, kept his distance, wiping down glasses that were already clean. Anything to avoid the beastly man at the end of the bar. The few patrons who dared to venture into the bar during daylight hours sat as far from Dewey as possible. Not that he noticed. Dewey was too busy making crude comments to the young woman working the bar that day. Her name was Jenny, a pretty girl with dark hair and tired eyes, who had seen her share of men like Dewey. She ignored his remarks as best she could, focusing on her work, but Dewey was persistent.
Hey, sweetheart, how about you come over here and give old Dewey a smile, huh? What's a pretty girl like you doing in a dump like this anyway? You know, you're too good for this place, though not too good for me.
Dewey slurred, his words dripping with condensation. Jenny didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the glass she was polishing. She had learned long ago that silence was the best response to men like Dewey. But Dewey wasn't one to be ignored.
Oh, come on. Don't be like that. I'm just trying to be friendly. Don't you want to be friendly with me?
He reached out a hand, dirty nails and all, as if to grab her, but Jenny quickly moved out of his reach.
Leave her alone, Dewey,
the bartender said gruffly, not looking up from the glass he was cleaning. Dewey sneered, but before he could respond, the door to the bar creaked open, and a gust of cool air swept through the room. Everyone turned to see who had entered, and the chatter died down to a whisper. A woman stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light from outside. As she stepped into the dim bar, her features became clearer. She was beautiful in an unsettling way, with sharp, angular features and dark, striking eyes that seemed to pierce through the gloom. Her long black hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and she moved with a grace that seemed out of place in such a dingy establishment. She scanned the room, her gaze lingering on Dewey for just a moment longer than anyone else. Then, with a slight smile, she made her way to the bar and sat down on the stool next to him. Dewey, taken aback by her beauty, momentarily forgot about Jenny.
Well, what do we have here? Dewey said, his eyes raking over the woman. Now, you're more my speed. What's a fine lady like you doing in a place like this?
The woman looked at him, her expression unreadable. I was looking for someone, she said, her voice smooth and calm. Dewey grinned, showing off his yellowed teeth.
Well, you found me, sweetheart. How about we get out of here and have some fun?
The woman tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes narrowing as she regarded him. That sounds like an excellent idea. Jenny shot Dewey a worried glance, but he ignored her, too thrilled by the idea of taking this mysterious beauty home. He threw some crumpled bills onto the bar, grabbed the woman's hand, and stumbled towards the door. The bartender watched them go, a strange expression on his face, but said nothing. Dewey's apartment was a mess, the kind of place that smelled of stale beer and old socks. The floors were littered with empty bottles and takeout containers, and the couch was more springs than cushions. But Dewey didn't care about the state of his home. He was too focused on the woman who had just walked through the door.
Make yourself at home,
Dewey said with a lecherous grin as he kicked some garbage out of the way. The woman didn't respond, simply looking around the apartment with an air of mild interest. As Dewey turned to shut the door, he caught the sight of his nephew, Danny, sitting on the floor of the living room, playing with a set of worn-out Legos. The sight of the boy seemed to annoy Dewey, and his expression soured.
Danny, what the hell are you doing out here? I told you to stay in your room,
Dewey barked, his voice harsh. Danny, a small, thin boy with sandy hair and big, innocent eyes, looked up at his uncle with fear. I was just playing, Uncle Dewey.
Yeah, well go play in your room, Dewey snapped. And close the damn door.
Danny scrambled to gather his toys, his small hands shaking, and hurried towards his room. As he did, he glanced up at the woman standing beside Dewey. She looked at Danny with an expression he couldn't quite place, almost sad. But there was something else there, something darker. Danny shivered and quickly retreated to his room, closing the door behind him, but not all the way. In his room, Danny tried to focus on building a small car with his Legos, but his hands were still trembling. He could hear Dewey talking to the woman in the other room, his voice low and slurred, and the woman's softer responses. Danny didn't like the way Dewey spoke to people, especially women. It reminded him of the day his parents had died, the day everything had changed. Danny's parents had been good people, kind and loving, but they'd been taken from him by a drunk driver when he was just 6 years old. With no other family to take him in, the state had awarded custody to Dewey, his mother's only brother. Dewey had never wanted Danny, but he did want the trust fund that came with him. The money was meant for Danny's care, but Dewey spent it on alcohol, drugs, and women, leaving Danny to fend for himself most of the time. As Danny tried to push those thoughts away, he accidentally knocked one of the wheels of his Lego car onto the floor. He watched in dismay as it rolled out of his room and into the hallway, stopping just under Dewey's bed. Danny hesitated, not wanting to go in his uncle's room, but he knew he couldn't finish the car without the wheel. Taking a deep breath, he quietly slipped out of his room and crept into Dewey's. The room was dark and the air was thick, with the smell of sweat and booze. Danny could hear Dewey and the woman in the living room, their voices muffled by the walls. He quickly spotted the wheel under the bed and dropped to his hands and knees to retrieve it. Just as his fingers closed around the small plastic wheel, he heard the door to Dewey's room open. Panicking, Danny froze, not daring to move, as Dewey and the woman entered the room. Danny squeezed himself further under the bed, pressing his back against the wall as he tried to make himself as small as possible. He didn't want Dewey to see him, He knew how angry his uncle could get. From his hiding place, he could hear Dewey's heavy footsteps as he approached the bed, followed by the softer steps of the woman.
"Well, here we are,"
Dewey said, his voice full of smug anticipation.
"Why don't you come over here and show old Dewey what you got?"
As Dewey sat on the edge of the bed, grinning like a fool, he didn't notice the change that had come over the woman standing before him. Her once smooth and elegant hands had transformed, each now gripping a jagged piece of antler, the sharp points gleaming menacingly in the dim light. The shift in her demeanor was subtle yet chilling. Her eyes, once alluring, now glinted with a cold, predatory hunger. Danny did his best to not move and not be heard, but through a small gap between the bed frame and the floor, he could see the woman's feet, and there was something wrong with them. They weren't human feet. They were hooves, like a deer, slender and delicate, but undeniably the hooves of an animal. Danny's heart began to pound in his chest, and he stared at disbelief. What was she? Dewey, still fumbling with his shirt, was oblivious to the danger. His clumsy fingers struggled with the buttons, his vision blurred from the alcohol. Finally, he managed to yank the shirt over his head, tossing it carelessly to the floor. He looked up, expecting to see the same seductive smile, but what he saw froze him in place. The woman was no longer smiling. Her face had hardened, her lips drawn into a thin line of cold determination. She moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Dewey's drunken mind barely had time to register the threat before the first blow landed. With a swift, brutal motion, the woman brought one of the antlers down across Dewey's chest. The jagged tip tore through his skin like paper, slicing a deep, ragged gash from his collarbone to his navel. Blood erupted from the wound, spraying across the room in a crimson arc, splattering the walls and floor. Dewey let out a strangled cry of pain, his eyes wide with shock and terror. Before he could even react, she struck again, this time with both antlers. She drove them into his abdomen with a force that sent him crashing back onto the bed, the mattress sagging under his weight. The antlers plunged deep into his flesh, puncturing vital organs with a sickening squelch. Blood gushed from the wounds, pooling around his body, soaking into the mattress. Dewey screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound that echoed through the small apartment. He tried to push her away, his hands scrabbling weakly at her arms, but she was relentless. With cold, calculated precision, she twisted the antlers inside him, tearing through muscle and bone, shredding his insides into a bloody mess. The tips of the antlers scraped against his rib cage, cracking bone with each vicious twist. The bed shook violently as Dewey thrashed in agony, his legs kicking out in a futile attempt to escape the relentless onslaught. But the woman didn't stop. She pulled the antlers out with a sickening sound, strings of viscera clinging to the bone, then brought them down again, this time aiming for his throat. The sharp points of the antlers sliced through his neck, severing the jugular vein with surgical precision. Blood sprayed from the wound in a high-pressure jet, covering the woman in a fine mist of red. Dewey's scream turned into a wet, gurgling noise as blood filled his mouth, bubbling up from his throat and spilling down his chin in thick, dark streams. His hands, slick with his own blood, clawed weakly at his neck, trying to stem the flow, but it was no use. The woman, her face expressionless, yanked the antlers free once more, then plunged them into his chest, directly into his heart. The force of the blow caused Dewey's entire body to jerk violently, the impact driving the breath from his lungs in a final, ragged gasp. Blood oozed from the corners of his mouth, his eyes rolling back in his head as the life drained out of him. His body convulsed one last time, then went still, his limbs falling limp at his sides. The bed, now drenched in blood, continued to sag under his weight. The once white sheets stained a deep, dark red. The woman stood up, her chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. She looked down at Dewey's lifeless body, her expression unreadable, then slowly pulled the antlers free from his chest. They came out with a wet, sucking sound, leaving behind gaping, ragged wounds that oozed blood. She stepped back, her hooves clicking softly against the blood-slicked floor. Her once pristine skin was now splattered with blood, her clothes clinging to her body, soaked in crimson. She surveyed the scene for a moment, then turned and walked out of the room, leaving Dewey's mutilated corpse sprawled on the bed, and Danny's petrified form watching her go. As the door to the apartment closed behind her, the room was silent, save for the slow drip of blood from the bed to the floor, a steady, rhythmic sound that echoed into the quiet night. 10 years passed, but the memory of that night never left Danny. The murder of his uncle remained unsolved, a gruesome mystery that had haunted the town for years. Danny had been found the next day by a concerned neighbor, still under the bed, too afraid to move or speak. He had been taken in by a foster family, a kind and loving couple who had cared for him as if he were their own. They'd helped him through the nightmares, through the fear that something was always lurking just out of sight, waiting for him. But the image of those hooved feet drenched in blood never faded. Now at 18, Danny was about to graduate high school, looking forward to college and a new life. The trauma of his childhood had shaped him, but it hadn't broken him. He'd worked hard to overcome his fears, to put the past behind him. He had even begun to believe that the creature he had seen that night was just a figment of his traumatized mind, a nightmare brought to life by the horrors of what he had witnessed. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. It was a warm summer evening when Danny finished his shift at the local Dairy Queen. His foster mom had asked him to pick up some groceries on the way home, so he stopped by a small mom-and-pop grocery store just down the street. The store was quiet, the only customer a woman browsing the shelves. Danny didn't pay her much attention as he headed toward the back to grab some milk. But as he reached for the carton, he heard the door to the store burst open. He turned just in time to see 2 masked men storm in, guns drawn. The old man working the register looked up in shock, his hands trembling as he fumbled to comply with their demands.
"Give us the money, old man, or we'll blow your head off,"
one of the men shouted, waving his gun in the cashier's face. The old man tried to open the register, but his hands were shaking too much. The gunman grew impatient, and without warning, one of them pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the store, and the cashier crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around his head. Danny ducked into the bathroom, heart pounding, as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He had heard the shot, and now there was silence, a silence that was almost worse than the chaos that had preceded it. Slowly, he pushed open the bathroom door, peeking out into the store. What he saw made his blood run cold. The 2 gunmen were laying on the floor, their bodies twisted and torn apart in ways that defied explanation. Blood was everywhere, staining the tiles and pooling around their broken limbs. And standing over them was the woman Danny had seen just moments ago. The same woman who had been in his Uncle Dewey's apartment 10 years ago. Her face was unchanged, still beautiful in that unsettling way. But her hands held the same antlers, dripping with blood of the men she had just slaughtered. Her feet. Danny's eyes traveled downward, confirming what he had always feared. Her feet were hooves, just as they had been on that night. The woman turned to Danny, a small smile on her lips as she regarded him. Her eyes were just as dark and piercing as he remembered, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. "It's okay, Danny," she said softly, her voice as calm and smooth as it had been all those years ago. "I'm not going to hurt you. I only come after bad people." She glanced down at the bodies of the men on the floor, her expression one of mild disdain. "These were bad men, Danny," she continued. "Your uncle was a bad man." Danny stood frozen, unable to move or speak. As she walked towards him, her hooves clicked on the hard floor, the sound almost gentle despite the horror she had just unleashed. She stopped in front of him, looked up into his eyes, and for a moment, Danny felt like a child again, hiding under the bed, terrified and alone. "Don't worry, Danny," she said, her voice softening. "You never have to see me again. Just stay a good boy." With that, she turned and walked out of the store, the only sound the fading clicks of her hooves as she disappeared into the night. Danny stood there, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should call the police, that he should tell someone what had just happened, but he couldn't bring himself to move. He just stood there, staring at the spot where the woman had been, trying to process the impossible. Finally, after what felt like hours, he took a deep breath and forced himself to move. He stepped over the bodies of the gunmen, careful not to look too closely, and walked out of the store. The night air was cool against his skin, and for the first time in 10 years, Danny felt a strange sense of peace. The past had finally caught up with him, but he was still standing. And as he walked home, he knew one thing for sure. He would never see her again.
Well, it looks like Danny will do just fine in this life. That is, unless somebody offers him some venison. Sweet nightmares.